McClements, who will discuss the subject of his most recent book. He has in the front page here of his slides, Future Foods, How Modern Science is Transforming the Way We Eat. This is a very timely subject, of course, with a massive impact on our well-being and also the well-being of the planet. So welcome, Professor McClements.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this. I had a great chat with some of the professors earlier today, and there's a lot of mutual interest in the kind of research we're doing and the kind of research you do in your department. So I just thought I'd start by giving a quick overview of some of the research areas that we're working in. Traditionally, I've done a lot of work on sort of polymers and emulsions, did a lot of work on food nanotechnology and delivery system design. So we use all sorts of different delivery systems, so like nanotechnology to assemble these different things for bioactive components. We've done a lot of work on understanding the sort of physics and chemistry of what happens in the gastrointestinal tract. And at the moment, we're doing a lot of work in this sort of plant-based food area. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. So as Orlando said here, like recently, probably a couple of years ago now, I wrote this book called Future Foods. And I think that really got me focused on not just looking at my own research, but was looking at all the different exciting things that were going on in the food area. And it's I've been working in this area for probably over 30 years now. And I think it's by far the most exciting time to be a food scientist. There's just so much interesting research going on from the molecular level upwards, with artificial intelligence and robotics and automation and personalized nutrition and the microbiome and genetics and plant-based food. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to do in this area. And I think we really need engineers and physicists and chemists bringing in a whole new skill set to tackle these incredibly complicated materials. So I'll talk about some of that sort of science today. So what we're really interested in is, how can we use design of foods to improve the properties of foods? And it's sort of the main areas that we would focus on in the food areas to things like, food quality. Foods have to look and taste good or nobody's going to eat them. Health and wellness. There's big problems in in society in general. There's things like diabetes and obesity and heart disease are increasing, and that's related to the kind of processed foods that we're eating. So can we use these sort of structural design principles to make healthier foods? There's big problems with food sustainability. There's a global population rises and we're trying to feed everybody. How can we change the food system to be able to feed all these people and do it in a sustainable fashion within planetary boundaries, without destroying our environment? And then things like food safety. We can use food design to make better antimicrobial delivery systems or better packaging materials to protect foods and try and do them from more sustainable plant-based ingredients. So when you look at food design, sort of the traditional method of designing foods was a really evolutionary process. Nobody set out to design bread or beer or cheese. These probably occurred through accidents that occurred throughout history. If somebody had some milk or something from a cow or a sheep, they left it out a little too long, it curdled, and you got this product formed, which thought was edible. And then over sort of hundreds or thousands of years, people talked to each other, and we got these new products developed. So so lots of these products we're familiar with have been around for thousands of years. But I think, this traditional sort of slow evolutionary method of developing foods is not suitable for the modern food industry. So we need to have a different approach. And that different approach is, it's almost like the Star Trek method. I used to watch the old Star Trek, which had like James Kirk, who I believe was a Canadian actor, William Shatner. And, on there they had the food replicator where you're on your spaceship, you could type in what kind of food you want and it would develop this food. So this is one of the things that started me off in this area. Was I was invited to a meeting in Boston by a complexity theorist, and he'd gathered together all these different people to work on this project, and they were trying to develop a food replicator for a Mars mission, and they'd got some money for NASA to work in this area, and they brought together a molecular gastronomist, a food author who's wrote a really classic book on food and the chemistry of foods, this complexity theorist. They had an astronaut, so this was like he was the commander of the International Space Station. And one of the things he was saying is one of the worst things about being in outer space is it's really depressing. You know, if you don't get interest in food, if you just eat mushy food all the time, it gets very, very depressing. So they really were, the astronauts were craving these exciting foods, and this is what was driving this process. So, you know, I sat in this meeting and I thought, this is a crazy idea. It's never going to work. You know, how are they ever going to make these foods? And then maybe 10 years later, you've actually got, you know, this 3D printing idea. So this is a restaurant which is in London called called Fooding. And if you go to this restaurant, they've actually 3D printed all the tables, all the cutlery, all the menus, and they 3D printed all the food in the restaurant. So you can actually go in, you know, and get everything 3D printed. So, you know, if you're doing that kind of thing, you really need to understand the rheological characteristics of the foodings. So things like emulsions and polymers and how they behave and how they form different structures to be able to do this. So there's a lot of science and engineering involved in making this practical. And you can create all sorts of interesting structures using this 3D printing. So these are some of the things that, you know, this company in the Netherlands does using a sort of home-based printer. So I think if you were training to be a chef in the future and you were trying to make some sort of fancy foods like this, you're probably better learning, you know, learning how to use software than trying to go into a culinary school and learn how to, you know, make these kind of structures, because it can all be printed now. So probably the sort of biggest thing in the food industry at the moment, which is really driving a lot of the research and a lot of the innovation that's going in this area, is the urge to get a more sustainable food system. I mean, there's increasing evidence from some really big reports that have come out that we're just not producing food sustainably at the moment. The population's predicted to grow to nearly 10 billion people by 2050. And lots of people are becoming wealthier. They're moving to cities and other urban centers. And as they become richer, they want a more sort of westernized style diet, which is high in protein and often high in sort of meat. So there's a prediction that we're going to need a lot more meat in the future. And meat production, as I said, is not sustainable. So if you look at like the protein yield from a cow compared to these other sources of protein, a cow is very, very inefficient at turning its feed into protein that we can actually eat. So if you look at, you know, if we just ate plants directly, so if you're a vegetarian, this is a much more efficient way of producing proteins rather than feeding them to cows. And on the other side, you know, they also, if you get food from animals, you get much more pollution and much more greenhouse gases produced. So it's not sustainable and it's bad for the environment. So we really need to reduce the amount of animal foods that we can consume. So this is really what's driving a lot of research in the food industry at the moment. If you just look at all the agricultural land which is available for producing food, something around 77% of it is used for producing livestock. But that livestock only produces about 17% of our calories. So if we could reduce the amount of animal foods that we ate, then we could reduce the amount of land we need to produce foods. And then that would have less problems in things like destroying things like the rainforest. So it would help improve biodiversity. And it would also help prevent things like COVID, because often, you know, if we got, you know, COVID is one of these zoonotic diseases, which goes from when we're in close proximity to animals. So there could be some real benefits from switching from animals to using other sources of protein. So what I'm going to talk about now is, you know, how we can use science and some of the approaches that are being used in order to sort of reduce our dependency on eating meat. So to do that, we have to make a product that somebody actually wants to eat. So we really need to deconstruct the burger. In this case, we'll use like a hamburger as an example, since I'm living in America. And on average, something like people eat about 3 hamburgers a week. So how do we make a sustainable burger that looks, tastes, and feels like the real thing? So if you look inside a burger, it's got all sorts of different things in it. You've got the meat, you've got adipose tissue, you've got some nerve tissues, and you've got all sorts of other structures. So how can we sort of mimic these structures using non-animal-based components? But probably most of you have heard about this now, is One way to do this is to use cultured meat. So this is meat that is grown in a test tube, or from a commercial point of view, it's going to be grown in a big fermentation vat. So it's going to be grown like we would grow beer. So what we can do is we can take a cell from a live animal, we can put it into some kind of nutrient broth, which has got growth factors and nutrients, and that's going to cause the cells to proliferate. Then we can collect the cells, we can process them, and we can make them into a burger. So in 2013, the first burger that on this technology was actually made, and they estimated this cost about $330,000. So a very expensive burger. And when the people tasted it, they had some reporters taste it. They said it tasted really dry. So it's a very expensive burger for something that didn't taste very good. And that was because it didn't have adipose tissue in. It only had the lean tissue in. So that was in 2013. So now it's like, can we actually turn this technology into products that people would eat? So we can still eat meat, but it's never been, we didn't have to kill any animals. So there's a really nice video from this company called Just Foods. So this is a company that's based in San Francisco, and they make plant-based foods, but they also use cultured meat. And they've got a nice video where they've got these chicken nuggets that they produced using this cell cultured method. And they actually took a cell from this chicken called Ian. So they took one of the cells from Ian and they made it into these chicken nuggets. And as the people in the company are eating the chicken nuggets, Ian's running around, still alive. So that's weird for the future. And if you think that's like a far-fetched reality, only like like a couple of months ago, Singapore's food agency actually passed legislation saying that we could actually eat these foods in Singapore now. And Just Foods has actually created a product which is being sold in this restaurant called 1818. So they've got a product that they're selling for like $23, which I think has just been sold probably last weekend. The first one of these was actually sold commercially. So it seems like there may be some commercial potential for this. So we don't have to stop at Ian, the chicken. We could also like take cells from our favorite celebrities and we could make sort of celebrity burgers. So you could take a cell from your favorite actor or singer or sports person, grow it up in a cell, and you could eat it while you're watching your hockey match or something, which might be a bit weird. Or you could even eat yourself. You could take one of your own cells and grow it up. And we could have like the Big Mac burger, which again, I think the government regulations might stop there by actually, self-cannibalism. And if you think that's far-fetched, there was actually some artists actually did this a couple of years ago. So they actually took some of their own cells and grew them up into food, and then they ate these foods. So I think there was a lot of sort of kickback from people saying that they're really promoting cannibalism. So I think it's like an interesting idea that you could do this, but yeah, probably not something most of us would want to do. So I think there's a lot of potential for this cultured meat, but this was a report that just came out last year, the end of last year, and it was saying that there's still huge hurdles to actually achieving this. So I think we hear a lot in the media about this cultured meat and how it's going to take over from conventional meat in the future, but it's still quite a long way from being economically viable. There's lots of challenges with actually growing these cell cultures and being able to do it in a cost-effective manner. They can only grow to a certain sort of yield, and then they start to inhibit themselves. And it's difficult to get sort of cost-effective growth factors. So the cost is, at the moment, it's too expensive for large-scale production of these meat. So it's not going to be a direct replacement. So an alternative to doing this is to, eat insects. So insects are much more efficient at converting sort of waste materials into proteins that we can eat than a cow is. So there's a lot of interest in consuming insects and turning insects into food in the future. And in some countries, especially Europe and the Netherlands, you can actually buy these products in the supermarket. So like the insect burger is popular with some consumers. So why would we want to eat these products? Well, if you compare their nutritional profile, it's quite similar to sort of meat and fish. They have a really high protein content. They have a high fat content, and you can see they've got a very good omega-3 fatty acids. So this is like one of the healthy fats. And also they have a very high fiber content. So they're full of all these food components which are supposed to be beneficial to health, like low fat content and high omega-3. So there's a good reason from a nutritional point of view why these foods could be turned into food. These insects could be turned into foods. There are some problems as well, though. Like some people, like if you have an allergy to shellfish, you might also have an allergy to insects. And actually, I think only last year, the European government has passed legislation to say that you can process certain kinds of insects now and incorporate them into human foods in Europe. I think one of the big challenges in this area is, especially in the West, is a lot of people look at insects and think, I don't want to eat that. This is not a problem all over the world. I think there's like 2 billion people around the world who already regularly consume insects. So, you know, it's really a cultural problem in the West. But I think this is something that we may be able to get over. You know, if you just look at, say, eating meat, you know, we often don't have this yuck factor when we're eating meat. But if you look at like a cow and you look at the meat that comes from it, you know, you wouldn't walk through a field and think, oh, I want to eat that cow or something. So I think we've just become sort of so accustomed to it culturally that we don't see a yuck factor here, but we do see one here. So I think this is something we can change. And if you just, you know, look at some of the foods that we do eat now, you know, if you look at like a lobster, you know, it just looks like a giant cockroach. Or if you look at, you know, this shrimp or prawn, it just looks like some kind of insect. And, you know, these oysters, I would never touch one. And I don't know why anybody would put this kind of gelatinous phlegm into your mouth. But anyway, so I think a lot of it's cultural bias. And if you look at something like the lobster in New England, maybe 200 years ago, there was multitudes of lobsters living off the coast in New England, and they were really, really cheap. And this was seen as a food that only sort of very, very poor people ate. But I think now it's really changed over like 100 or 200 years, and things that we thought were disgusting and most people wouldn't eat, we will eat now. So potentially, you know, some of these things might be, you know, very acceptable in 10 or 100 years' time. So bugs are a really sustainable source of protein, and we could eat them in different ways. You know, some people who are very adventurous can, you know, just put the whole bug in their mouth. I went to teach a class about future foods in my daughter's high school, and, you know, I brought in I brought in a bag of insects, and I brought in a bag of potato chips, and I said, you know, one of these products is really unhealthy for you, and one of them is really healthy. Which one do you want? And they all said the healthy one. So I gave them the insects, and a lot of them were really brave enough to actually eat these insects. You know, the insects had less fat and they had more minerals and omega-3 fatty acids and things like that. But if people are not comfortable with eating insects, then you can always grind them down and make them into a flour. And then you can incorporate that flour into different food products to sort of fortify them with proteins and minerals and healthy lipids. Or you can also use the insects as a sort of a source of functional ingredients. So they could be proteins, but they could be other ingredients in here. So can we, you know, break down the insect's body, and it's going to have lots of different unique proteins in there. So can you use those proteins as gelling agents in foods? Or can you use them as emulsifiers or foaming agents? So I think this is an interesting area for the future, is, you know, using some of the techniques that have been developed for isolating proteins from plants or other sources. Can we use the same ones for insects and identify some ingredients that have really unique functional attributes? And as I said, in Europe, this is really taking off, and there's a lot of companies are actually producing these insects now. So like this company Protix has this huge big factory, and they have something like 7 billion insects in that factory at any particular time. So that's about the same as the population of people on the planet Earth. So you can take these insects and they're converting them into animal foods, or they're converting them into human foods. So I think there's a lot of potential of this in the future. So the last one I'll talk about is these sort of the plant-based food, which we've heard a lot about. So this was a picture taken in spring in 2018. So it's only like 3 years ago. And this is when I went to Florida. So it was still winter in Massachusetts. We had snow on the floor. And we went to Florida, to Miami for a week. And when we were there, it was really hard to find it, sort of this Impossible Burger, but we actually managed to find it in one of the restaurants there. So it was really rare, but within that 3 years, it's gone from a sort of really niche product to a multi-billion-dollar company. So now Impossible Foods is worth $4 billion. But when you think about it, this is even more, the science behind this is even more incredible than trying to make insect burgers or trying to make cultured burgers by growing cells in a test tube. You're trying to change ingredients in plants, which are completely different from those in animals. And you're trying to make something that's got the same characteristics. And one of the things that Impossible Burger did, which was really interesting, is they identified in real meat this heme group, which comes from like myoglobin or hemoglobin, has got an iron in it. So this particular heme group with iron in is responsible for the desirable color of meat and responsible for the desirable flavor profile of meat. So it causes chemical reactions to occur that gives meat its meatiness and meaty appearance. So what they managed to do is to find in nature, they looked at soybeans and they looked at the roots of soybeans, and they were able to find a vegetable version of heme, but there wasn't enough of it in these in the roots of the plants to be able to scale up on a commercial level. So they used sort of cellular agriculture approaches to create this plant-based heme protein, and then they isolated and incorporated into their product. So this is like a really rapidly growing area, and I would say like almost every other week, some companies contacting me about this area. So it's a really exciting area to work in. And just to give you an idea, there's like something like $13 billion invested in the last 2 years in this area. So it's definitely one of the fastest growing area and a really important area to focus on. You know, and some of the big sort of driving force in this area for consumers is, as I said before, you know, animal products are really bad for the environment and sustainability. So people have done a life cycle analysis comparing sort of a regular beef burger with a meat burger, sort of plant-based burger. And you can see that to do that is to create the plant-based burger, there's something like 99% less water, you know, 90% less land, much less greenhouse emissions and much less energy use. So this is much more sustainable. So Beyond Meat claims that, you know, if the average American consumer just switched one of their beef burgers to Beyond Meat burger every week, that would be the equivalent of taking like 12 million cars off the road. So that could have a real big impact on the environment if we just changed our eating habits. And if these things look and taste exactly the same, why wouldn't you eat the plant-based one? So one reason why you might not is, I mean, people often assume, oh, I've got a plant-based diet, it's going to be healthier for you. But once you get to these sort of highly processed foods, like, you know, some of these plant-based burgers, that's not necessarily true, at least at the moment. If you compare the nutritional profile of a beef burger and a Beyond plant-based burger, you can see this has actually got more calories, more saturated fat, which is mainly coconut oil, more salt, which could be bad for hypertension, less protein and more carbohydrates, which could be bad for diabetes. So at the moment, the plant-based burger is not as healthy as a regular beef burger. And I think this is an area where we need to carry out more research in the future, where we can use fundamental engineering principles and physics and chemistry in order to try and design products with better nutritional profiles. So I think from a material science point of view, if you just look at a burger or any meat product, it's incredibly complicated. You've got hundreds of different ingredients, 100 different types of molecules that are all organized into very complicated structures. And you have to design all sorts of characteristics of this product. You have to create the way it looks. So that depends on the way light waves bounce off the surface of here. So that's going to be, you're going to get some light scattering and some selective light absorption. And that's going to affect the opacity and the color. And you need to control that. Then you also got to get the same flavor profile as meat and the same aroma and same taste as meat. So you have to produce the same kind of volatile molecules as you would get from meat, but you've got to do it using plant-based ingredients. So that's incredibly challenging. So you need to be able to measure that and then be able to find plant-based alternatives. Then you've got to get the same texture and the same mouthfeel. So it's got to break down the same in the mouth as a regular burger does. So that's when I first had the Impossible Burger. The first bite was really good, but it came really mushy in your mouth. So you have to design that into the product to make it break down slowly. So you have to understand what holds the proteins together and how those structures break down. And another thing you have to design is actually the sound. So if you put this in a frying pan and you cook it, it makes a very characteristic sound. So can you actually design that into the plant-based burger? So you need to understand the physics of acoustics and the sort of the physical basis of the bubbles bursting and creating this unique sort of sizzling sound that you get when you have a burger. So from a material science point of view, this is enormously challenging. So I think so far, companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have done a really good job with processed meat products. So things like burgers and sausages and mincemeat. But it's much harder to do like whole cuts of meat. So I think this is going to be the next generation of plant-based meat products, is can you make something that looks like a chicken breast or a pork chop or a sort of a beef steak using all plant-based ingredients. So this is one of the areas that we're working on at the moment. And to do that, you really need to understand the structural organization or the architecture of meat products. So you have to, if you look inside a meat product, you have these sort of proteins that are assembled into little fibers that make bigger fibers that make bigger fibers. These are all covered by connective tissue. But if you look inside plants, nearly all plant proteins are globular proteins. So these are very small proteins. So you're trying to mimic this incredibly complicated fibrous structure using globular proteins. So I was talking to one of the professors earlier today, and what we're trying to do is like, how can you get these plant-based proteins to form these fibrous structures so you can mimic the architecture of meat so that it sort of behaves the same way from a textural appearance and mouthfeel kind of way. So what we've been doing in my lab is trying to use some soft matter physics approaches to try and to mimic things like the muscle and connective tissue. So we're using things like thermodynamic incompatibility methods and selective gelation methods, where we're mixing plant-based proteins and polysaccharides together, and that induces phase separation. And then if we can shear it and gel it, we can create these sort of fibrous structures that somewhat mimic what's going on in meat. And then we're also trying to mimic the adipose tissue in meat. So this is what adipose tissue looks like. You have fat surrounded by cells, and we're trying to mimic that using emulsions. So we've got fat droplets surrounded by plant-based proteins to try and mimic this structure. And we can make something that looks very much like fat, but it's all plant-based. Then the other thing is, like, once you actually eat this food, what happens to it inside your body? Often when I've had like a plant-based burger, it really sits in my stomach and it seems really, it just doesn't feel right. So we've been looking at using simulated digestion models to understand what happens to regular meat and plant-based meat inside your gastrointestinal tract. So we look at, this is in the mouth, the stomach and the small intestine, and we've got like pepsin in here and other enzymes. And then we've got proteases and lipases in here, which will break down the fat and the protein. And you can see that they behave somewhat similarly, but also somewhat differently. And then we measure things like the protein digestion. So this is like how much protein is hydrolyzed in the different regions of the gastrointestinal tract. So you can see only a small amount gets hydrolyzed in the stomach. And then when you go to the small intestine, most of it gets hydrolyzed. And again, the animal proteins and the plant proteins behave somewhat similarly, but you get less digestion in the stomach with a plant-based one. So that might be why they sit in your stomach and feel heavy. but you get almost full digestion of the meat ones in your intestine. So I think this is going to be an important area in the future, is looking at the digestibility of these things and how we can control them, because that's going to affect their nutritional effects. And it's not just plant-based meat that's important. People are also looking at other kinds of components like eggs and milk and cheese and other kinds of products. And again, we really need a fundamental scientific approach to understand these. You know, where are the emulsifiers in the system? You know, how do they keep the system stable? How does that affect the creaminess of the product and the stability of the product? Or how can we make plant-based ingredients that will gel at the same temperature as regular egg proteins? So one way to do that is use plant-based proteins, but people are also using cellular agriculture to make, say, milk products, which have got animal proteins in, but the animal proteins have never been inside an animal. So what people are doing is they're, say, taking the DNA sequence for a known milk protein, so something like casein or beta-lactoglobulin. So they take the DNA sequence from the internet, they synthesize the DNA, they put it in a plasmid, and then they inject the plasmid into a microorganism, say like a yeast or a bacteria. And then when the microorganism is going around its normal business, it will secrete milk proteins. And then you can sort of break up the cell, you can separate the milk proteins, and then you can use these milk proteins to form things like yogurt or cheese or milk. So these are real animal proteins, but they've been produced using fermentation processes rather than having to kill any animals. So again, in principle, this could be better for the environment, and it's going to be better ethically because you're not killing any animals. The big challenge again is the economics and the scale up. Is actually, can you do this economically? And people are not just doing it with milk, people have also done it with eggs. So this is another company from San Francisco, Clara Foods, who are creating egg proteins, and then they can sell that as an ingredient you can use in all sorts of different products. So that's sort of how people are trying to improve their sustainability and environmental aspects. So now we'll look at another important area is trying to redesign processed foods to make people healthier. So as I said before, there's some big problems with the modern food supply, is that it's causing a lot of health problems. So things like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and cancer are all linked to the foods we eat. So what people are trying to do is to use food design processes to try and control the way that foods behave in your body. So some of the things that people are trying to do is like reduce the calorie density of food. Can we make foods look the same as can we make a processed food look the same as a regular food, but reduce its calorie density? Or can we control the rate at which people chew foods or digest foods? If you digest foods too quickly, you may get like a spike in glucose in your blood. And then that could lead to dysregulation of your hormonal system, and that can lead to overeating and diabetes. So can we redesign foods to control their digestion rate? Can we increase the bioavailability of the beneficial nutrients in food? Or can we control the release at which ingredients are released in the gastrointestinal tract? So can we release something, say, in the colon or the small intestine? For example, probiotics we want to release in the colon. So I'll just give a sort of quick overview of some of the work going on in this area. So as I said, like obesity is really increasing and diabetes is increasing in the US, and that has been linked to these overconsumption of these highly processed foods. So I think the food industry has done a fantastic job in making foods that people want to eat, but they're not necessarily healthy for you. So this is, there's a real urge to try and redesign these foods. So I'll focus in my research area. We do a lot of work on emulsion-based foods, so things like mayonnaise or sauces or lots of beverages, other things like sauces you get in microwave meals. So these would be emulsions. And what we're interested in is, can we understand the relationship between their quality attributes? So things like their shelf life, their rheology, their optical properties, their flavor profile, the way they behave in your body. And can we relate that to their composition and microstructure? So like the particle size and charge and interactions. And then can we relate that to the ingredients that they contain? And if we can understand this, then maybe we can redesign foods. So we can make something that looks and tastes just as good as the regular food, but it's got a lower calorie density. So to do that, you need to understand the relationship between food quality and the characteristics of your product. So this shows just for food emulsions, this shows like viscosity, appearance, and flavor intensity versus fat content. So as you increase the fat content, you get more and more fat droplets, the viscosity increases. So if you remove the fat, it's going to change the texture of your product. So you have to do something to replace that. The fat droplets will scatter light. So if you remove them, then the product will go from a nice creamy appearance to changing its appearance. Or if you take the fat out, you change the flavor profile. So again, you have to reformulate your product. And then we're interested in, like, if we put it on our tongue, how does it spread on our tongue? And how does that release the flavors and lead to the mouthfeel? So we need to understand all those characteristics. So what we can do is, if we take the fat droplets out, we can use sort of structural design principles to try and create other kinds of polymers or particles that will replace some of the desirable characteristics of the fat. So things like the scattering of light to give the creamy appearance, or the viscosity to give the sort of mouthfeel or the textural characteristics. So we can use things like titanium dioxide to get light scattering, or we can make, if we don't want to use these inorganic materials, we can make protein nanoparticles which will scatter light, and we can use them instead of fat. We can use things like water and oil emulsions, where we replace some of the fat with water, but they still have the same appearance and texture. Or similarly, we can use hydrogel beads or things like microclusters. So we've used all these different approaches to try and change the characteristics. Another thing that's important, as I mentioned before, is the digestibility of foods. And there's a big argument now about ultra-processed foods. And if we process foods too much and break down all the cellular structures of food, then they get digested far too quickly in our body. So we get a big spike of metabolites in our bloodstream. And then that leads to hormone and metabolic dysregulation. So can we sort of redesign foods to make them digested more slowly, and therefore we don't get these problems? And this is really based on evolution. As when our ancient ancestors lived in a non-modern environment, it was very difficult to find food in the environment. So they were eating lots of sort of fruits and vegetables and nuts and cereals and things like that, which were trapped in sort of dietary fiber-rich cellular structures. So our gastrointestinal tracts developed like highly acidic stomach and lots of enzymes to really effectively break down these food sources and release them so our body could absorb them. And that was great when we lived in an environment when there wasn't a lot of food around. But now we're surrounded by an environment where all this ultra-processed food, our gastrointestinal tract has stayed the same from an evolutionary point of view. So it really efficiently digests everything. And then that leads to all these spikes in our blood of the different components we eat. So what happens is, if you have like a lightly processed food, so this might be a whole food, it gets digested very slowly in your body because you've got all these cellular structures, and the enzymes can't get in and break down these cellular structures very well. And what that does is it leads to lots of digestion products being present at the end of the small intestine. And then your body has these sensors which detects them, and that leads to a satiety signal which is sent to your brain, and then that stops you eating. So this process stops you overeating. But if we have these highly processed foods, all the cellular structure has been broken down, and now the enzymes can access the fats and the starch really easily, so they get digested and absorbed very, very quickly. So at the end of the small intestine, there's very few digestion products left. So your body's thinking, oh, I haven't eaten enough, so you keep eating. So this will tend to make you overeat. So this is why we're trying to redesign foods to make them more digested more slowly. So as I said, if you get a rapidly digested food, you get these big spikes in your bloodstream, and you get all sorts of metabolites in your blood, which are going to cause problems. So we want to slow this process down. So this is some of the different approaches we've used in my lab to try and slow down digestion. For example, we've coated fat droplets or starch granules with indigestible fibers to try and prevent the digestive enzymes from reaching the fat droplets. Or we've crystallized the fat droplets because crystalline fat is digested more slowly than liquid fat. We've formed clusters in the gastrointestinal tract. And again, when you form these big clusters, it's more difficult for the digestive enzymes to get in. We've embedded macronutrients inside dietary fiber particles. We've added components like dietary fibers, which will bind to bile salts, or they bind to digestive enzymes, and that will interfere with the digestion process. Or we can add biopolymers, which will enhance the viscosity of the stomach, the gastrointestinal juices in the stomach or the small intestine, and change diffusion and mixing processes. So there's lots of different strategies you can use. So this is just one approach that we use for slowing down the digestion of lipids. So these are fat droplets, and they're trapped inside an alginate bead. So if you have free fat droplets, they get digested very quickly in the small intestine. So this is the release of fatty acids after you add lipase in the small intestine conditions. If you encapsulate the fat droplets, you can really slow down their digestibility. So these should give bigger satiety and make people feel fuller quicker, so they eat less food. And you can control the rate of digestion by changing the pore size. So the smaller the pores, the more difficult it is for the enzymes to get in, and the slower the digestibility. This is some work we did with nanochitin. So this is a nanofiber that you can extract from food. And we looked at the digestion of an emulsion stabilized by a conventional emulsifier and with nanochitin. And you can see you can slow digestion with this nanochitin because it forms a shell around the fat droplets, and that makes it more difficult for the enzymes to get there. And also because it binds things like the digestive enzymes or the bile salts, and that interferes with the digestion process. So this is another way of controlling digestibility. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about is like using foods as medicine. It's like, how can we redesign foods to make them healthier by encapsulating different kinds of bioactive ingredients in here. So we've done a lot of work on sort of nutraceuticals, which are these small molecules that you find in natural fruits and vegetables, which act somewhat like pharmaceuticals and somewhat like nutrients. So things like curcumin or carotenoids like lycopene or resveratrol from grapes or wine. So these molecules are claimed to have health benefits, like they may be able to inhibit diabetes, or they're natural antioxidants and they might inhibit inflammation, or sort of progression of cancer and things like that. So there's a lot of interest in incorporating these molecules into foods. The problem with a lot of them is they're very hydrophobic, so they've got low water solubility. They're often crystalline. Many of them are chemically unstable, or they're broken down by enzymes in our gastrointestinal tract. And that often leads to a low bioavailability. So we're often like trying to encapsulate these in different kinds of delivery systems. So we've used all sorts of different delivery systems depending on the nature of the bioactive component to encapsulate them. So I'll just use one example. This is curcumin. So curcumin has been used in traditional Indian and Chinese medicine for over 1,000 years for its potential health benefits. So we typically use in the food industries to give color and flavor, so it has like a nice orange color. But it's also got these anti-inflammatory characteristics and other kind of beneficial properties. But it's very hydrophobic and it tends to be crystalline. So we developed a plant-based nanoemulsion. So this is a plant-based nanoemulsion, which is all based from botanical ingredients. And we use what's called this pH shift method. So we took the curcumin, we dissolved it in an alkaline solution where it's at a high pH. This is completely soluble in water. Then we mixed it with our nanoemulsion at neutral pH, and that causes the curcumin to go hydrophobic, and then it goes inside the fat droplets. So then we can get this curcumin nanoemulsion. And then we compared the bioavailability of our system with some commercial products that we bought from the supermarket. And you can see these vary in price enormously, from like almost $10 for 60 capsules up to like $41. So there's a huge difference in the price of them. And some of these are just like crystalline curcumin, and some of them have used like advanced technologies to encapsulate the curcumin, like micelles. And then we put these systems through a simulated gastrointestinal tract where we simulate the mouth, stomach, and small intestine. We measured the lipid digestion, we centrifuge it, we collect what's called the mixed micelle phase, and we measure the amount of the curcumin, which is solubilized in these mixed micelles. And then this will tell you how much is available for absorption. So you can see, like, for this cheap nature-made product, which is all crystals, so like this one here, hardly any of it's bioaccessible. So you would eat this and you would just come out and you would have orange feces. If you pay, the most expensive one wasn't that good either. So you're paying lots of money, and again, mostly curcumin is just going out in your poop. But if you have a well-designed delivery system, you can actually get a high bioaccessibility of these products. And our plant-based nanoemulsion was the same as this one here, this commercial product, which was made out of synthetic ingredients. Okay, so just to finish with, I think we're doing a lot of food design. We're trying to make foods healthier and more sustainable. But by far the most important thing that consumers think is it has to be cheap, it has to be convenient, and it has to taste good. So I think in the past, these have been like the main drivers of food design, is, making it cheap, convenient, and tasty. So I think this was like the old paradigm of food science. But I think this has really changed now. And I think these things are absolutely critical. And we have to, any new food that we make has to have these characteristics. But also it should be ethical. So we're not, confining and slaughtering lots of animals. It's got to be sustainable, because we've got to feed everybody on the planet a good quality diet. And it's got to be healthy. We want to reduce the amount of diabetes and cancer and obesity. And we also have to have a resilient food system. So we've just seen from COVID the challenges that can happen to the food system. So I think this is the sort of new paradigm for food design. And I was talking about future foods, and I only mentioned a few things that are important. I mean, there's all sorts of other things like artificial intelligence, robotics, vertical farming, oral processing, food architecture, gene editing, the microbiome. So I think there's just tons of interesting research going on in this area. And it's an absolutely critical area. So again, thank you very much for listening to me. I know it's a long talk with lots of information in. If you want to find out a bit more about some of this, I cover a lot of these different things in that book, Future Foods. But as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's such an exciting time to be in the food science area. And I think you see lots of other disciplines moving into this area. So we do a lot of work with Harvard and MIT, and a lot of the professors there are moving into the food area because they can see what a complicated material it is and how important it is to redesign these foods to make them more sustainable and healthy for us. So if anybody's got any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julian, Professor McClements, for this wonderful talk. It's really amazing. I love the fact that here you really have a lot of cross-cutting subjects working together, from medicine to material science.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. So we have now the chat open for questions, and I think we can read those for you. Maybe we start with John Frosted. He has 2 questions on his side, then I will continue. Please, John.
Yeah, so our first question is from Jordan Piet, and he asks, when moving to plant-based meats, will things like food poisoning from undercooked food still be a problem?
I think it'd be less of a problem. I mean, I think you still have to make sure that you cook your foods properly with plant-based meats, but you're going to get less of the sort of bacteria that normally live on animals. So I think it would be less of a problem, but obviously you still have to cook your foods through.
Very good. Another question from Marina. She asks, do you believe the products with delayed digestion will be adopted by food companies who would make more profit by selling larger quantities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, and at the moment, nobody's advertising their products on digestibility. So I think that really is the next generation. I think if we do want to control overeating, which is not in the interest of the food industry, they want you to overeat because then you can spend more money. So I think you'd have to maybe increase the price of your product so you could keep your profit. And I think we need to do that anyway. I think food is too cheap. I think by focusing on cheapness, you get a poor quality product that's bad for your health. So I think we do need to pay a little bit more money and have these foods redesigned to make them healthier.
I take over a little bit about one question on my behalf, and is the fact that digestibility can be controlled by using some nanopolysaccharides. And you mentioned nanochitin, of course. The other one is nanocellulose. Chitin is okay for use in food, but I don't know about nanochitin. I don't know about nanocellulose, and we have worked on this together. And I wonder about the regulation of those emerging nanomaterials.
No, I think that's a big challenge working in this area. And even chitosan is not grass in the US. So it's not generally recognized as safe as an ingredient in the US at the moment. So I think that is going to be a big challenge. I know they're doing a lot of work in Harvard in this area on sort of nanocellulose, and I think they've done a lot of the sort of toxicity studies, and they claim that it's not very, it doesn't exhibit any kind of toxicity. But I think somebody has to take that data to the USDA and actually get it approved.
Yeah, thank you. Johan has a question, Johan, and then I can continue here. Go ahead.
Thanks for the great talk, Julian. I see how much we overlap in like polymers and chemistry and all these other fields, which I wouldn't think of as food, but certainly are. First question, mechanochemistry. How much does that play into the digestion? Is it just mechanical and chemistry, or is there actually, like, are we inducing reactions through chewing or digestion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated process that starts in your mouth. So I think, first of all, you get the saliva coming in, and everybody's saliva is a little bit different. And saliva's got amylase in and mucin, which is a big glycoprotein that can interact with your food system. And then that slips down your esophagus, and then you're going into the acidic stomach. Then you get all sorts of churning. There's been some really good sort of fluid dynamic simulations of the stomach and looking at the forces and fluid mechanics that's going on there. And then the digestive enzymes are gonna diffuse in there, and then small intestine, you've got this like peristaltic pump going on, and again you're secreting all these enzymes and bile salts, and they're all binding to different interfaces. So it's incredibly complicated interfacial and surface chemistry process. So I think it's a really rich area for research in this area.
Okay.
Well, before going to, yeah, go ahead, Johan.
No, I was just going to ask if you've ever looked at templating proteins onto things like nanocellulose. I figured that Orlando would have brought this up with you already, but it seems like a great opportunity if you haven't.
Yeah, I think you couldn't covalently attach them. I mean, I think you could from a research point of view, but I think from an application point of view, you wouldn't be able to get that through the regulations. But you could physically absorb them on there.
Yeah, I don't think you need to chemically attach. Just use the one to template the other.
Yeah,
something we could talk about offline.
We have here 3 more questions. John has 4 more, and then we have Cameron. So let's try to see if we can cover all as much as possible. One question here is, do you have any tips for chemical engineers seeking positions in the food industry? Chemical engineers.
Yeah, I think when I do consulting in the food industry, you look at like probably only half the people are food scientists, probably less than half. And so I think a lot of chemical engineers get good jobs in the food industry. Tips on getting it, I think just apply for the job. Like look for the jobs and apply for them. And I think they're definitely looking for chemical engineers because I think they really value that skill set.
John, maybe you can go ahead, and then we go with Cameron that has a live question.
Yep, I've got 7 here, so I'll do maybe 2, then we'll jump over to Cameron, and then we'll see how far we can get. So this question is from Brandon Chen. Very interesting and engaging talk. Do you have any tips? Oh, sorry, we just have that one. Okay, so from Jane Hill, actually. So Jane, do you want to ask it directly since you're on video? Or do you want me to read it?
Sure. Well, I'll just read it. Julian, it was a fantastic talk. Really, really interesting. I love the big picture view. And I'm glad I actually had my video and sound off because there was a lot of groaning. Oh my God, wouldn't eat that. Land lobsters. Yes, good perspective. So it was fantastic. I could probably ask 1,000 questions, but I have a big picture question. Do we really need to move through a meat-like phase to get to where we're trying to get to, which of course may change as we go along that path? Are you seeing that culturally this is necessary, that people need to see meat-like things?
Yeah, I've often thought that. I mean, I'm a vegetarian. I don't really care
Right, me
like
too.
beef or not. You know, it could be anything. I mean, I don't know why people are not just creating, you know, like the new tofu. I mean, I've learned to like tofu and
Right.
stuff like that. I don't love it, but you know, we could create any kind of protein rich or any kind of nutrient thing. So it's, yeah, I don't know. I think maybe we do have to go through this phase because I think they're trying to attract meat eaters. So I think they're not making this product for vegetarians. They're making it for carnivores. So yeah, but maybe that's the step we have to go through. But I think we can be really creative as food scientists or engineers. We can create any kind of protein-rich product.
Yes, very
orange or, it could be orange or green or square or whatever. Yeah, as long as it tastes good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. And that covers Mattheo's question that I have here. So maybe Cameron, you can jump in very quickly on a short question, please.
Yeah, great. Fantastic talk. This was very interesting stuff and not stuff I'm used to thinking about. But my question is more about like, I guess it's related to food security for lower income people. How is the shelf stability of these engineered foods that you're producing compared to more traditional foods?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're usually designed to have really good shelf stability. So a lot of these really cheap products are really highly processed. So they tend to be, you know, like all the bacteria and other problems have been knocked out. So I think, I mean, there's a big movement now to do like minimal processing. So how can you process them enough so you don't damage all the valuable nutrients and stuff in there, but you do kill all the bad bacteria and stuff in. So I think like traditionally we just heated stuff to death, which has made them safe, but haven't necessarily made them nutritious. So I think that's another area I didn't mention, but I think, you know, like minimal processing is another important area. But yeah, great question.
Excellent. I have one, and then we jump to John. There is one here from me, Sven, about the health benefits comparing curcumin with plant grounded versus the emulsions. Are they comparable? And why should we choose supplements over eating the plant source in the first place?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's two things. I mean, ideally you'd want to eat the plant source. So I think if you can afford it and you've got the time to do it, it's probably always better to eat like whole foods. I'm lazy and I tend to eat microwave meals because I just can't be bothered doing it. So what I'd want is good processed food. So convenience is important for me. But and for a lot of people, just haven't got the time to do it. So that's one reason you might have these highly processed foods. But then the other reason is, you know, if you eat a raw carrot and you measure like how much carotenoids, which is like this healthy ingredient from carrot, gets into your body, it's only about 5%. But if you can encapsulate them, you can get maybe 50 or 70%. So you can get 10-fold higher amount of these beneficial ingredients into your body.
Wonderful. John, you can jump in.
Fantastic. So this next one is from Carl Zimmerman. A fantastically interesting talk, perhaps a crazy idea, but could you design foods that don't release unhealthy fats, etc., so you could still enjoy eating them, but reduce the unhealthy side effects?
Yeah, I mean, there was like a really important invention, like, I don't know if you've heard of Olestra. So it's like this fat that, it's basically a sugar molecule with all these fatty acids attached around it. So it looks and behaves exactly like fat, but the digestive enzymes can't get in and cut the ester bonds. So it just passes through your small intestine, you don't absorb it, so you don't get any calories. So the company who invented it spent 10 years, you know, getting it millions of dollars to get it approved. But then when they put it into food products, there was a little problem with this thing called anal leakage. So, you know, and they had to put it on their label. So nobody wants to buy a product which is going to give you anal leakage. But I think they've sort of redesigned it so you don't get that problem anymore. And we actually put a patent in a few years ago where we had fat droplets and we coated them with dietary fiber shells so that, again, they could pass through your intestine without getting digested. So I think it's definitely possible. But there are side effects, and that's one of the problems with foods. There are often unforeseen side effects. You really have to take a holistic approach and look at all the potential things that can happen when you redesign them.
Good. So we are running out of time. Maybe two more questions, John, if they are quick, so that we should finish in 5 or so minutes.
Sure. Next one from Henriette. Is it possible to delay digestion of lipids while keeping the digestion rate of liposoluble bioactives?
Yeah, typically what we found is if you reduce the lipid digestion rate, what can happen is the oil-soluble vitamins can be trapped inside the non-digested oil. So typically when you reduce lipid digestion, you reduce bioaccessibility. And that's what happened with that olestra as well, is the fat didn't get absorbed, but it trapped all the oil-soluble vitamins. So then you could get vitamin deficiencies. So it is important. So what you could do in that case is have two different types of particles. One that was highly digestible with the vitamins in, and then the other one that was slowly digestible. So again, you can use these sort of design principles to do that.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
So our last question will be from Dr. David Kitts. How do we balance the positives of reducing digestive caloric intakes from fats using technology methods with the negatives of poor bioavailability of fat-soluble vitamins? So it's a similar question.
Yeah, so that's a similar kind of answer then. So maybe you would use two different types of colloidal particles. So one of them would be a slowly digestible fat, and then the other one would be a rapidly digestible fat that had the oil-soluble vitamins in. So you could get that balance.
Yeah, a double emulsion, probably a multi-phase system, right?
Well, this would actually be two different emulsions made out of different materials. So, for example, one could be made out of mineral oil, and one would be made out of a like MCT or something.
Excellent. So we have in a few minutes other event coordinated by undergraduate and graduate students. I will ask everybody to unmute to give an applause to Julian. Thank you so much for the super interesting talk, Julian. We appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
It was really to have you here, and we hope to welcome you in UBC in the near future in person.
All right, cool. Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Julian. And thank everybody for joining. We had around 140 people. They stayed with us all the time. So it was really, really great. Thank you so much.